In 2019, a 26-year-old nuclear engineer named Sarah walked out of the University of Waterloo with a master's degree, zero debt, and 3 competing job offers waiting for her. One came from a Canadian Crown corporation offering $87,000 a year. Another came from a German energy company offering $94,000. The third came from a California clean energy startup offering $180,000, stock options, a full relocation package, and a signing bonus larger than her parents' first mortgage. She accepted the California offer almost immediately. And that decision, repeated quietly by thousands of highly skilled engineers across North America over the last decade, helps explain a much larger story now unfolding beneath the surface of the global energy economy. For 4 years, Sarah worked on next-generation small modular reactor systems for a startup that raised more than $2 billion in venture capital and was widely promoted as one of the future pillars of American clean energy development. She was not watching the energy transition happen. She was building it. Then, in the spring of 2023, the H-1B visa renewal process that had been routine for 4 years suddenly wasn't. New processing times, new documentation requirements, new uncertainty about whether her status would be extended. And underneath all of it, a quiet but unmistakable shift in the political environment surrounding skilled immigration that made the future feel less certain than it had in 2019. Sarah called her mother in Mississauga on a Tuesday night. The call lasted 2 hours. By the end of it, she had already started looking at job postings in Canada. What she found surprised her, and what happened next, both to her and to the broader Canadian clean energy sector she returned to, is a story almost nobody has told properly. Because it isn't just a story about one engineer coming home, it is a story about what happens when the country that spent decades training the world's best technical talent finally decides to keep it. To understand the scale of what Canada lost over the last 2 decades, you need one number. Between 2000 and 2022, Canada produced approximately 340,000 STEM graduates annually from its university system, one of the highest per capita rates of technical graduate production in the entire Western world. The University of Waterloo alone produced more engineering graduates per year than most small European countries. Of those graduates, estimates from Statistics Canada and the Conference Board of Canada consistently suggested that between 30 and 40% left the country within 5 years of graduation. Not because they wanted to leave, but because the economic incentives to stay were not competitive. American technology companies, American defense contractors, and American clean energy firms were offering salaries that Canadian employers, both public and private, were structurally unable to match. The nuclear and clean energy sector was hit especially hard. Canada has one of the most sophisticated nuclear engineering programs in the world. CANDU reactor technology, developed entirely in Canada, powered grids across Asia, Europe, and South America for decades. The expertise required to design, build, and maintain these systems takes years to develop and cannot be easily imported from elsewhere. Between 2005 and 2020, Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, the Crown Corporation responsible for managing the country's nuclear technology heritage, went through a partial privatization, significant workforce reductions, and a period of strategic uncertainty that sent a clear signal to the country's most talented nuclear engineers. The future of the sector in Canada is not guaranteed. Go where it is. And they went primarily to the United States, but also to the United Kingdom, South Korea, France, and the United Arab Emirates. All countries investing aggressively in nuclear energy infrastructure, while Canada hesitated. The brain drain in nuclear engineering specifically became so severe that by 2018, industry associations were warning Canada risked losing the institutional knowledge required to operate its own nuclear fleet within a single generation. That is the context Sarah left behind when she took the California offer in 2019. She wasn't abandoning Canada. She was making the rational decision that any 26-year-old with her skills and options would make. The country had not given her sufficient reason to stay, so she left. What changed between 2019 and 2023 was not primarily about Sarah. It was about two things happening simultaneously on opposite sides of the border. One pulling her back toward Canada and one pushing her away from the United States. The pull side of the equation began in 2021 when the Canadian government committed to net zero emissions by 2050 and published a detailed clean energy roadmap that, for the first time, explicitly identified small modular reactors, SMRs, as a central pillar of Canada's long-term energy strategy. That commitment came with funding, real funding, not the kind of announcement that gets made at a press conference and then quietly disappears in the next budget cycle. By 2022, 3 Canadian provinces had signed a memorandum of understanding to jointly develop SMR technology. Ontario Power Generation had selected a specific reactor design for deployment at its Darlington site, the first new nuclear construction approval in Canada in over 30 years. And the federal government had created the Canada Growth Fund with explicit mandates covering clean energy infrastructure investment. For nuclear engineers watching from abroad, these were not abstract policy signals. They were job postings waiting to happen. An approved reactor construction project at Darlington doesn't just need a few engineers. It needs hundreds of them across design, safety analysis, regulatory compliance, material science, instrumentation, and construction management. And it needs them for decades because nuclear projects do not conclude in a single electoral cycle. That was the pull. The push came from a completely different direction, and it arrived faster than anyone in the Canadian policy community had anticipated. When Sarah started looking at Canadian postings in late 2023, she expected to find the same landscape she had left in 2019. Modest salaries, limited private sector options, and a public sector that moved slowly and paid conservatively. What she found instead was a sector in the early stages of a transformation it had been building toward for 2 years. Ontario Power Generation was actively recruiting. Terrestrial Energy, a Canadian SMR company, had just closed a major funding round and needed senior engineers immediately. Atkins Realis, formerly SNC Lavalин's engineering division, had rebuilt its nuclear practice and was hiring aggressively for projects across Canada and internationally. The salary gap had not fully closed. Canadian nuclear engineering compensation in 2023 was still below American levels in absolute terms, but the gap had narrowed significantly. And more importantly, the total value proposition had shifted. Canadian employers were now offering equity participation, pension security, career stability, and the specific appeal of working on projects that would actually be built. Not just designed, funded, and then canceled when the political winds changed. Sarah accepted a position with Ontario Power Generation in February 2024. Senior Reactor Systems Engineer, Darlington SMR project. Her salary was $40,000 less per year than California. She took it anyway, because the H-1B uncertainty had made the American option feel fragile in a way it hadn't in 2019. And because the Canadian option had become something it had not been 5 years earlier, genuinely compelling on its own terms, she was not alone. Between 2022 and 2026, Canada's nuclear and clean energy sector reversed a brain drain that had been accelerating for 20 years. The reversal was not dramatic. It did not happen overnight. But the direction changed. And in talent markets, direction matters more than speed. While Canada was quietly rebuilding its technical talent base, the United States was discovering a problem it had not fully anticipated. The Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 had committed hundreds of billions of dollars to clean energy deployment: wind, solar, battery storage, and nuclear. It was the largest single investment in energy infrastructure in American history. And it assumed without fully verifying that the workforce required to execute it existed. It did not. Not at the scale needed, not with the specific expertise required, and not distributed across the geographic regions where the projects were actually planned. Nuclear engineering is not a skill that can be rapidly scaled. Unlike software development, where a motivated person can become productive within months, nuclear engineering requires years of formal education, years of supervised practical experience, and critically, access to operating reactors and research facilities during the training period. You cannot manufacture nuclear engineers quickly. You grow them slowly inside institutions that have been doing it for decades. The United States had been growing fewer of them than it needed for years, partly because of the long period of nuclear stagnation following 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl, when the political environment made nuclear careers feel uncertain. Partly because American universities had gradually reduced nuclear engineering program capacity as enrollment declined. And partly because the engineers who did graduate from American programs were often recruited into adjacent fields: defense, aerospace, advanced materials, where compensation was higher and project timelines were shorter. By 2024, the Department of Energy's own workforce assessments were identifying a critical shortage of nuclear engineers, reactor operators, and health physics specialists that would become severely limiting within 3 to 5 years if not addressed. The assessment noted specifically that a significant portion of the experienced nuclear workforce was concentrated in workers over 55, meaning retirements alone would accelerate the shortage regardless of new project demand. The administration's response was to look internationally, specifically to look at countries that had been producing nuclear engineers at high rates and whose graduates might be recruitable into American projects. Canada was at the top of that list. It had always been at the top of that list. But in 2024, something was different. The engineers America wanted to recruit were increasingly choosing to stay home. Sarah's former manager in California spent 6 months trying to find her replacement after she left. He interviewed 11 candidates. He made offers to 3 of them. 2 declined. 1 accepted and left for a competing firm after 4 months. The position remained open for the better part of a year. He told a colleague that recruiting nuclear engineers in 2024 felt like trying to hire in a market where someone had moved the supply somewhere he couldn't find it. He wasn't wrong. The supply had moved. It had moved to Darlington. The story of Canada's engineering talent reversal is not simply a story about individual decisions made by individual engineers. It is a story about what happens when a country makes a sustained, credible commitment to a specific industrial sector over a long period of time, and finally aligns immigration policy, infrastructure investment, workforce development, and industrial strategy in the same direction.